Donovan checked his watch again, irritation flickering across his sharp features. He wasn't a man accustomed to waiting, especially not for a blind date he hadn't even wanted in the first place. His sister, Olivia, had insisted. "You work too much, Caleb, just one date, humor me." Now, sitting in the dimly lit, impossibly expensive restaurant, he was regretting giving in. He glanced around the room, searching for a woman who looked like she was waiting for someone. His date, Rachel was that her name, was supposed to be wearing a red dress, and then he saw her. A woman in a stunning deep red dress stood near the entrance, adjusting the strap of her purse. She was beautiful in a way that made the air shift around her. Dark waves of hair framed her face, her lips slightly parted as if she were debating whether to stay or leave. Without thinking, Caleb stood and strode toward her. "Rachel?" he asked, his deep voice cutting through the hum of conversation. She blinked in surprise. "What? Rachel, right?" he repeated, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm Caleb." "Your blind date." The woman's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, she hesitated, glancing past him toward the tables. Then, to his surprise, she let out a soft laugh. "Okay, sure, why not?" He frowned slightly. "You sound uncertain." She tilted her head, amusement dancing in her eyes. "No, it's just, never mind, let's go." Caleb wasn't sure what to make of that, but he wasn't about to question his luck. He led her to the table, pulling out her chair before sitting across from her. "So tell me about yourself," he said, studying her. She hesitated. "Well, wait," he interrupted, realizing something. "I don't think I caught your last name." She hesitated again, then lifted her wine glass. "Let's just say it's been a long week and I could use a nice dinner." Caleb chuckled, intrigued. "Fair enough." The conversation flowed easily, something he hadn't expected. She was sharp-witted, confident, and completely unlike the women he usually met in his world of high-stakes business and cold negotiations. He found himself leaning in, listening more closely, laughing more than he had in months. By the time dessert arrived, Caleb was certain of one thing: he wanted to see her again. "Would you like to do this again sometime?" he asked, watching her closely. She hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe." Caleb wasn't used to maybes. He was a man who got what he wanted. And right now he wanted her. But then, as they stood to leave, another woman rushed into the restaurant, breathless. "Caleb Donovan," he turned, brow furrowing. "Yes." The woman in front of him, his actual blind date, Rachel, gave him a confused look. "I'm so sorry I'm late. The traffic was terrible." Caleb slowly turned back to the woman he had just spent the evening with. She was biting her lip, trying to suppress a laugh. "You're not Rachel," he said slowly. She grinned. "Nope." Something unexpected happened then. Instead of being annoyed, Caleb laughed a deep, genuine laugh. "So, who are you?" he asked, completely captivated. She winked. "Guess you'll have to find out." And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing there, utterly intrigued. Caleb Donovan didn't usually lose his composure. He was a man who thrived on control, precision, and knowing exactly what to expect. But as he stood in the middle of the restaurant, watching the mystery woman disappear through the revolving doors, he realized something unsettling. He wanted to chase after her. Instead, he turned back to Rachel, the real Rachel, who was staring at him with a mix of confusion and mild irritation. "That wasn't you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Rachel scoffed, brushing a strand of perfectly styled blonde hair behind her ear. "Obviously not. Who was she?" Caleb exhaled, running a hand down his jaw. "I have no idea." Rachel folded her arms. "Wait. So you just sat through an entire dinner with a complete stranger?" He glanced back at the door, something warm and unfamiliar tugging at his chest. "Apparently." Rachel let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Well, I guess I can't be mad. That's kind of hilarious." Then she sighed, adjusting the strap of her purse. Look, Caleb, I appreciate the effort, but I think we can both agree this is a little too ridiculous to recover from. He barely heard her. His mind was still on the woman in the red dress, the way she had smiled at him. How natural their conversation had been, the teasing lilt in her voice. He had been completely captivated, and now she was gone. Rachel waved a hand in front of his face. Yeah, okay, you're clearly not even here anymore. Caleb snapped back to the moment. He gave Rachel a polite nod. You're probably right, but I do apologize for the mix-up. Rachel shrugged. No hard feelings. Good luck finding your mystery woman. With that, she turned on her heel and walked toward the hostess stand, leaving Caleb standing alone. He exhaled, then pulled out his phone, dialing a number from memory. It rang twice before his sister, Olivia, answered. Please tell me you didn't scare Rachel off. Caleb ignored the jab. I need a favor. A pause. That was fast. What kind of favor? I need to find someone. Olivia sighed dramatically. What did you do? She wasn't Rachel, he said simply. Another pause. Then, wait, what? I sat through an entire dinner with the wrong woman and I didn't realize it until the real Rachel showed up. Silence. And then, Olivia burst into laughter. Oh, this is amazing. Caleb Donovan, king of control, gets duped by a random woman. I love this. Caleb pinched the bridge of his nose. Are you going to help me or not? Olivia hummed, clearly enjoying dragging this out. Do you at least know her name? No. Oh, this just keeps getting better. He clenched his jaw. Olivia. Fine, fine. I'll see what I can do. Caleb ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket, glancing once more toward the door. He wasn't sure why he felt this pull, this need to find her, but something told him this wasn't over, not even close. The next morning, Caleb sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His assistant, Marcus, knocked once before stepping inside. There's a woman waiting in the lobby for you, Marcus said, adjusting his tie. She won't give her name, just that it's important. Caleb turned, brows lifting slightly. Did she say what it was about? Marcus shook his head. No, but she did say something strange. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Go on. Marcus hesitated, then smirked slightly. She said, tell him it's the woman he mistook for his date. Caleb's pulse jumped. He stood immediately, striding toward the elevator without another word. By the time he reached the lobby, his eyes scanned the room quickly, and then he saw her. The same dark waves, the same confident posture, the same teasing glint in her eyes. She had come back. She turned as he approached, arching a brow. Well, well, the man who takes strangers to dinner. Caleb crossed his arms, tilting his head. You came to see me. She shrugged, but he caught the amusement flickering across her face. I figured you might have questions. He studied her for a moment. And will you finally tell me your name? She pretended to consider it. Maybe. Caleb exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Come upstairs. She hesitated briefly, then nodded. All right. Lead the way. As they stepped into the elevator, Caleb pressed the button for his office floor, his mind racing. He didn't know why she had come back, but he was damn sure going to find out. The elevator doors slid open, and Caleb led the woman into his office. She stepped inside with an air of quiet confidence, her eyes sweeping across the space as if she were cataloging every detail. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, casting long shadows across the sleek, modern furnishings. She took a few steps toward the windows, her fingers grazing the edge of his polished desk before she turned back to face him. She didn't look nervous. If anything, she seemed amused by the entire situation. Caleb leaned against the desk, arms crossed. You tracked me down. She tilted her head, a knowing smile playing at her lips. I wouldn't say tracked. Your last name was on the reservation at the restaurant, and well, you're not exactly hard to find. He let out a quiet breath, considering her. That still doesn't explain why you're here. She tapped a manicured nail against his desk, her expression thoughtful. Maybe I was curious. Most men would have been furious to realize they spent the evening with the wrong woman, but you weren't. Caleb studied her, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly. Should I have been? She shrugged. That depends. Did you enjoy yourself? He didn't answer right away, and that alone seemed to amuse her. She moved toward one of the chairs in front of his desk and settled into it with ease, as if she belonged there. You still haven't told me your name, he said, watching her. She exhaled a soft laugh. You're persistent. I prefer determined. She considered him for a moment before finally relenting. Elena, he repeated it once under his breath as if testing how it felt on his tongue. Elena, he said again, this time with more certainty. Her expression shifted slightly, but she masked it before he could decipher what it meant. So now that you know my name, what's next? Caleb pushed off the desk, closing the distance between them. I don't believe in coincidences. You could have just disappeared after that night, but you didn't. Elena leaned back slightly in her chair, though there was no tension in her posture. Maybe I just wanted to see if you'd chase me. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. And did I? That depends, she mused. Are you going to? There was something electric in the air, a pull between them that neither seemed willing to acknowledge outright. He wasn't used to this being drawn into something unpredictable, something that didn't come with a clear strategy. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind. Elena, he said carefully, I don't think you're the type to play games without a reason. She tapped her fingers against the arm of the chair, her gaze flickering toward the window before returning to him. I have my reasons. Something about the way she said it made him pause. There was something unspoken beneath her words, something she wasn't quite ready to reveal. Then let me take you to dinner, he said. She raised a brow, again, this time on purpose. Elena considered his offer for a long moment, then rose to her feet. She smoothed the fabric of her dress, her expression unreadable. I'll think about it. That wasn't the answer he was expecting. She turned toward the door, but before she could leave, he spoke again. I don't like unfinished business. She glanced back over her shoulder, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then I guess you'll just have to find a way to finish it. And with that, she walked out, leaving Caleb standing there with a feeling he wasn't used to. Anticipation. Caleb wasn't a man accustomed to waiting. Yet, for the past 2 days, he found himself distracted by the absence of a response from Elena. He had expected her to reach out, or at the very least, leave him with a way to contact her first. Instead, she had walked out of his office, leaving only a lingering intrigue that refused to fade. The frustration was unfamiliar. He was used to directness, to people who either wanted something from him or made it clear they didn't. Elena was neither. She had stepped into his life by accident, and yet she carried herself as if she belonged there, as if she had chosen to leave him wondering. Marcus entered the office, setting a folder on the desk. You've been staring out the window for 15 minutes, he remarked. Caleb didn't turn. And? That's not like you, Caleb finally faced him. I don't recall hiring you for personal analysis. Marcus smirked. Fair enough, but if you're waiting for her to come to you, you might be waiting a while. Caleb leaned against his desk, exhaling slowly. She'll come back. And if she doesn't? His jaw tightened. Then I'll find her. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Let me know if you need anything. As the door closed behind him, Caleb reached for his phone. He wasn't going to waste any more time. Elena hadn't expected Caleb to stay on her mind, but here she was, standing outside a cafe with her hand hovering over her phone. She had spent the past 2 days telling herself that she had done the right thing by leaving things open-ended. It was safer that way. But something about Caleb Donovan made her want to take a risk. Before she could talk herself out of it, she sent him a message with nothing more than an address and a time. No explanation, No promise, just enough to see if he would show up. She didn't have to wait long for his response. Caleb arrived at the location 5 minutes early, stepping out of his car to find himself in front of a bookstore tucked between two larger buildings. It wasn't what he had expected. He had anticipated a restaurant, a bar, maybe even some exclusive event, but not this. Inside, the scent of old pages and fresh ink filled the air. He scanned the aisles until he found her at the far end of the store, flipping through a hardcover. She looked up as if she had sensed him before he even spoke. "You came," she said, closing the book. "You gave me an address. Did you think I wouldn't?" She smiled slightly. "I wasn't sure." Caleb studied her, noting the way she seemed more at ease in this place. "You work here?" She nodded, setting the book back on the shelf. "I help run it. My aunt owns the place." It was the first real piece of personal information she had volunteered. He didn't press, letting the moment settle. "So, was this a test?" he asked. Elena tilted her head. "Maybe. You don't seem like the type to spend time in a place like this. You don't seem like the type to assume things about people you barely know." That earned him a small laugh. "Fair enough." A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Caleb glanced around, taking in the quiet hum of the shop. "You wanted me to see this part of your world." Elena's expression softened. "I wanted to see if you'd fit in it," he considered that. "And," she studied him for a long moment before answering, "I haven't decided yet." Caleb smirked. "Then I suppose I'll have to convince you." Elena's lips parted as if she were about to respond, but then a voice called from the front of the store. "Elena, we need you for a second." She sighed, glancing toward the entrance. "Duty calls." Caleb took a step closer. "I'll wait." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable before she nodded. "All right." As she disappeared toward the front, Caleb ran his fingers over the spine of a book nearby, considering how easily she had drawn him into her world, and how much he wanted to stay in it. Elena returned after a few minutes, slipping back into the aisle with a curious expression. Caleb was still there, casually flipping through a book as if he belonged in the quiet, literary world she had grown up in. It was strange seeing him here, a man who exuded power and control, standing amid dusty shelves and well-worn paperbacks. "You're still here," she observed, crossing her arms. He glanced up, smirking slightly. "You told me to wait." She leaned against the nearest shelf, studying him. Most people would have used that as an excuse to leave. Caleb closed the book in his hands, setting it back in its place. "I'm not most people." Elena already knew that. There was something about him, an unshakable confidence, an intensity that made it impossible to look away. And yet, there was something else too. Something quieter beneath the surface, something she wasn't sure he let many people see. She tilted her head. "So what do you think?" "About," she gestured around them, "this, my world." He took a slow glance around the bookstore before bringing his gaze back to hers. "It suits you." Elena raised an eyebrow. "That's not an answer." Caleb stepped closer, the space between them narrowing. "I think it's unexpected, and I like that." She wasn't sure why, but the admission sent a flicker of warmth through her. "You don't seem like the type who enjoys surprises." "I don't," he admitted, "but I'm starting to make exceptions." Something about the way he said it made her pulse jump. She was used to men who flattered easily, who said things they thought she wanted to hear. But Caleb, he didn't waste words. Everything he said felt deliberate, carefully measured. And yet, here he was, standing in her bookstore, stepping into a world so different from his own without hesitation. Elena cleared her throat, pushing past the sudden tension. "So what happens now?" Caleb leaned against the shelf beside her, his gaze unwavering. "That depends on you." She exhaled a quiet laugh. "That's a dangerous thing to say," he smirked. "I like a little danger." Elena shook her head, but the amusement in her eyes betrayed her. "All right then, let's see how well you handle it." She pushed off the shelf and walked toward the front of the store, deliberately not looking back. If he wanted to keep up, he would, and something told her he would. An hour later, they were seated at a small cafe a few blocks from the bookstore. It wasn't the kind of place Caleb typically frequented, no reservations required, no extravagant decor. Just a cozy corner with mismatched chairs and a lingering scent of coffee and vanilla. Elena stirred her drink, watching him over the rim of her cup. "You don't seem uncomfortable." Caleb took a sip of his coffee, unfazed. "Should I be?" she shrugged. "Most people in your world don't exactly do casual." He set his cup down, his gaze steady. "You assume a lot about my world." Elena met his stare. "And you assume a lot about mine." Caleb leaned back slightly, considering her. "Then maybe we should stop assuming," she smirked. "That would take all the fun out of it." His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, an understanding, a challenge. "You like to keep people guessing, don't you?" Elena took a slow sip of her drink before answering. "I like to keep my options open." Caleb studied her for a moment before nodding slightly. "Fair enough." A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. If anything, it felt like a negotiation, two people testing the limits of an unspoken agreement neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. Finally, Elena set her cup down and leaned forward slightly. "So tell me something real." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Something real?" "Yes," she said, "something you don't usually tell people." He didn't answer immediately, which intrigued her. Caleb Donovan didn't seem like the type to struggle with words, yet here he was, hesitating. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't trust easily." Elena hadn't expected that. "Why?" His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Because trust is a liability when you're in my position." She watched him carefully. "And yet, you're here with me." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Like I said, I'm making exceptions." Elena tapped her fingers against the table, considering him. "All right, your turn. Ask me something." Caleb didn't miss a beat. "Why did you come back to see me?" She exhaled softly, her fingers stilling against the table. "Because, for some reason, I wanted to." That wasn't a real answer, and they both knew it, but for now it was enough. Caleb nodded once, as if accepting her response for what it was. "Then I guess we have something in common." Elena smiled slightly. "I guess we do." And just like that, the game between them shifted into something neither of them had expected. Caleb had never been the type to dwell on uncertainty. His world operated on precision numbers, negotiations, strategies. There was no room for ambiguity. And yet, that was exactly what Elena was, an enigma, a question without an immediate answer. 2 days had passed since their last meeting at the cafe, and she lingered in his thoughts far more than he cared to admit. He wasn't a man who chased, but with her, it didn't feel like chasing. It felt like something else entirely, something unfamiliar and dangerously compelling. So when an invitation arrived hand-delivered to his office, no sender listed, he wasn't surprised. He was, however, intrigued. A black envelope, elegantly sealed. Inside, a single card with an address and a time. No explanation, no signature. Elena, he should have hesitated. He didn't. That evening, he arrived at the location, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind iron gates and a long, winding driveway. The house was old but meticulously maintained, the kind of place that held stories in its walls. The sound of music drifted from within, a soft, lilting melody that was neither modern nor dated, existing in a timeless space. A gathering was underway, not extravagant but intimate. People moved through the grand foyer, champagne glasses in hand, laughter weaving through the air. Caleb recognized no one. Then he saw her. Elena stood near the staircase, engaged in conversation with an older woman who bore a striking resemblance to her. The woman's hand rested on Elena's arm, her expression warm, familiar. Caleb didn't interrupt, he observed. Elena spotted him before he had the chance to approach. A flicker of something crossed her face, acknowledgement, amusement, maybe even satisfaction. She murmured something to the woman beside her, then made her way toward him, her steps unhurried. "You came," she said, stopping just short of touching distance. "You invited me." Her lips curved slightly. "I wasn't sure you'd accept." He glanced around. "You enjoy testing people, don't you?" Elena tilted her head. "Only the interesting ones." Caleb's gaze flicked back to the woman she had been speaking with. "Family, my aunt," she confirmed, "the one who owns the bookstore." That piece of information settled into place, another thread in the puzzle that was Elena. "You didn't mention this would be a family gathering," he noted. "You didn't ask." Caleb exhaled softly, shaking his head. "You have a habit of keeping people off balance." She leaned in slightly. "And yet you're still here." Before he could respond, a voice called her name. She turned, her expression shifting ever so slightly before she masked it. A man approached, tall, well-dressed, carrying himself with the easy familiarity of someone who had known her for a long time. Caleb didn't miss the way Elena's shoulders tensed for just a fraction of a second. The man stopped beside her, his hand resting lightly on her lower back. Too familiar, too practiced. "Elena," the man said smoothly, "you disappeared on me." "I was occupied," she replied, her tone even. The man's gaze flicked to Caleb, assessing. He extended a hand. "James." "Old friend of Elena's." Caleb shook it, his grip firm. "Caleb." James held his stare a beat too long before releasing. Something unspoken passed between them, a silent challenge, an unspoken history Caleb wasn't yet privy to. Elena exhaled through her nose, something like impatience flashing across her face. "James, can I steal you for a moment?" James interrupted smoothly, his smile practiced. She hesitated. "Barely." Caleb watched her, waiting for her decision. Finally, she sighed. "Excuse me for a moment," she said to Caleb, her tone unreadable. He nodded once, stepping back as she and James moved away, but he wasn't going anywhere. This wasn't over. Caleb watched as Elena disappeared into the crowd with James, his jaw tightening just enough to betray his irritation. He had expected Elena to challenge him, to push him into situations where he wasn't entirely in control. But he hadn't expected this, watching her walk away with a man who clearly had a history with her. One she hadn't bothered to mention. He wasn't the jealous type, or at least he never had been. But something about the way James had touched her, the way she had hesitated before walking off with him, set an unfamiliar tension in his chest. A waiter passed by, offering him a drink. He accepted it, more out of habit than desire, taking a slow sip as he continued to observe the room. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't the kind of man who backed down. If Elena thought she could keep him at arm's length, she was mistaken. Minutes passed. He lost sight of her, but he didn't move. He knew she'd return, and then she did. Elena reappeared at the edge of the room, her expression carefully neutral as she scanned the crowd. The moment her eyes landed on Caleb, something in her face shifted, an almost imperceptible flicker of relief. She made her way back to him, her pace steady, but there was something in the set of her shoulders, the way she exhaled just before reaching him, that told him whatever conversation she just had hadn't been pleasant. Caleb didn't ask right away. Instead, he simply offered her a glass from a passing waiter. She accepted it, tilting it slightly before taking a sip. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone even. Elena's lips parted as if she were about to deflect, but then she hesitated. "James likes to think he still has a say in my life." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Does he?" Her gaze sharpened. "No." That was all he needed to hear. She took another sip of her drink before setting the glass down on a nearby table. "You stayed. You told me to come." A small smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I didn't tell you to stay." Caleb stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "I don't walk away from things that interest me." Elena inhaled slowly, her fingers grazing the stem of her glass, though she didn't pick it up again. "You always this persistent?" she asked. "When it matters," he replied. She studied him as if trying to decide whether she liked that answer or not. Then, after a beat, she said, "Come with me." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked toward one of the side doors leading out to a terrace. He followed without hesitation. The night air was cooler than expected, crisp, and laced with the faint scent of jasmine from the garden below. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but the estate itself felt like its own world, secluded, untouched by the chaos beyond its gates. Elena leaned against the stone railing, crossing her arms. "You don't seem like the kind of man who enjoys being out of his element." Caleb slid his hands into his pockets, standing beside her. "You don't seem like the kind of woman who lets people see past the surface." She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Maybe we're both full of surprises." "Maybe," he admitted. A silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't charged with challenge. It was something else, something unspoken. Finally, Elena exhaled, her fingers tapping against the railing. "James and I were engaged once." Caleb had suspected as much, but hearing her say it still sent a sharp flicker of something territorial through him. "And now?" he asked, keeping his voice measured. She shook her head. "Now, he's a reminder of who I used to be and why I don't want to be that person anymore." Caleb didn't push for more. He didn't need to. He understood what she was saying. She turned fully toward him then, tilting her head slightly. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not," he said simply. "But if he's the past, why do I get the feeling he's still trying to be the present?" Her expression darkened slightly, but she didn't look away. "Because James isn't the kind of man who lets go easily." Caleb held her gaze. "Neither am I." Elena's breath hitched just slightly, but it was enough. She didn't step back, neither did he. The distance between them was almost non-existent now, the air charged in a way that had nothing to do with words. For the first time since meeting her, Caleb didn't feel like he was chasing. She was right here, standing still, and that changed everything. Caleb had never been the kind of man to let emotions dictate his actions. His world had always been about control, about making the right moves at the right time. Yet, as he stood there with Elena, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between them, control felt like an illusion. She wasn't just another intrigue. She wasn't just a challenge he wanted to solve. She was something else entirely, something that made him forget logic, forget strategy. Elena's gaze flickered with something unreadable before she finally stepped back, breaking the moment. But the air between them was still charged, the tension still lingering. She turned toward the railing again, fingers tracing its cool surface. "You don't scare easily, do you?" Caleb exhaled slowly, keeping his eyes on her. "No." A shadow of a smile crossed her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "James thought he owned me once. That's why he still circles. He doesn't understand that possession and love aren't the same thing." Caleb's fingers curled slightly at his sides, his jaw tightening. He had known men like James before, men who mistook control for devotion, who thought they had a right to something just because they once held it. "He doesn't own you," Caleb said, his voice steady. Elena turned, her expression softer now. "No, he doesn't." She didn't offer more. She didn't need to. The moment stretched, neither of them moving, neither of them willing to be the first to look away. Then, finally, she let out a quiet breath. "Come on, let's get out of here." She didn't wait for his response, just slipped back inside through the terrace doors. Caleb hesitated only a second before following. The drive was quiet, the hum of the city fading into the background as Elena leaned against the car window, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Caleb didn't push her to speak. He had learned that she gave pieces of herself in her own time. When they reached his building, she didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the car and followed him inside, past the sleek lobby, past the silent halls, and into the penthouse that overlooked the city skyline. She took in the space, minimalistic, controlled, everything in perfect order. It was a stark contrast to the warmth of her bookstore, to the effortless charm of her world. "You live like a man who never lets anything slip through his fingers," she murmured, running her hand along the back of the leather couch. Caleb loosened his tie, watching her. "And yet here you are." She turned to face him fully now, something shifting in her expression. "Yes, here I am." There was no more distance between them, no more barriers. Caleb closed the space between them, his hand lifting to her face, fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned into his touch, her breath catching just slightly. "I don't want to be careful with you," she admitted, her voice just above a whisper. Caleb's thumb brushed over her cheek, his grip firm but gentle. "Then don't be." The silence between them burned, heavy with everything that hadn't been said. She reached for him first. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. By the time dawn broke, Elena sat curled up in the oversized chair near the window, wrapped in one of Caleb's dress shirts, her fingers tracing lazy patterns against the fabric. The city stretched below them, still half asleep, the early light casting everything in a soft glow. Caleb stood nearby, pouring a cup of coffee, watching her with a quiet intensity. She glanced over at him, offering the smallest of smiles. "You're staring." He didn't deny it. "I like looking at you." Elena let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You say things like that so easily." Caleb crossed the room, handing her the coffee before settling beside her. "I don't say things I don't mean." She studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "I know." There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt, and that, Caleb realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. Because he had fallen for her, completely, irrevocably, and for the first time in his life he didn't mind losing control. Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Caleb's penthouse, a quiet stillness settling over her. The city stretched beyond the glass, a glittering expanse of lights and movement, but none of it felt as consuming as the man watching her from across the room. Caleb had barely taken his eyes off her since she'd woken up, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. It wasn't possessiveness, no, nothing about Caleb was careless or impulsive. It was something deeper, something that felt like certainty. She exhaled slowly, placing her coffee cup on the nearby table before turning to face him. He stood near the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up, leaning against the marble countertop as if he wasn't entirely sure what to do with himself. It was the first time she'd ever seen him look remotely hesitant. "You're thinking too much," she murmured, crossing the space between them. Caleb's lips curved slightly, but the intensity in his gaze didn't waver. "I'm thinking just enough." She stopped in front of him, tilting her head. "And what conclusion have you come to?" His fingers brushed against her wrist, tracing the delicate skin there before he finally answered. "That I don't want this to be temporary." The words settled between them, heavier than anything else they had exchanged before. Elena's breath caught, her pulse kicking up in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so much of her life controlling the pace of things, deciding when to walk away before anyone else could. But Caleb had never played by the rules she was used to. She swallowed hard, searching his face. "You don't even know everything about me." Caleb's hand slid up her arm, his touch deliberate. "I know enough." Elena let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible." His other hand came up, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "And you're unforgettable." The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. She had spent so long keeping people at a distance, convincing herself that attachment was dangerous, that nothing lasted. And yet, standing there in Caleb's arms, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: safe. But safety wasn't the same as certainty. She hesitated, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt as if anchoring herself. "What if this doesn't work?" Caleb's thumb brushed over her cheek, his expression unreadable. "What if it does?" Elena sucked in a breath. She wasn't used to people challenging her fears so effortlessly, wasn't used to someone looking at her as if walking away simply wasn't an option. Her heart pounded as he leaned in, his lips grazing the corner of her mouth before he spoke again. Stay. It wasn't a question. She could feel the weight behind it, the meaning he wasn't saying outright. Stay not just for the morning, not just until the city woke up and reality set in. Stay in his life, in his world, in whatever they were building between them. Elena's fingers tightened in his shirt, and for once, she didn't think. She just nodded. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe in something that wasn't temporary. Elena opened her eyes to the soft glow of morning sunlight filtering through the penthouse windows. The warmth of Caleb's arms around her was the first thing she felt, solid and unyielding, as if even in sleep, he refused to let her go. She turned slightly, watching the way his chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. His face relaxed in a way she rarely saw when he was awake. The sharp edges of his usual composure had softened, revealing something more vulnerable beneath. She reached up, tracing a light fingertip along his jaw, and almost immediately his eyes flickered open, dark and unreadable. But when they settled on her, something eased in his expression. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice rough from sleep. A small smile tugged at her lips. "I said I would be." His grip around her tightened briefly before he exhaled, his forehead resting against hers. "Good." For a long moment, neither of them moved, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the morning. Then, reluctantly, Elena shifted, stretching slightly. "I should probably go check in at the bookstore." Caleb didn't release her. If anything, his hold became firmer. "Not yet." She let out a soft laugh. "You can't keep me here forever." His hand slid against the small of her back, his thumb tracing absent patterns against her skin. "I can try." Elena rolled her eyes but didn't make any real effort to move. Minutes passed before she finally sighed. "I suppose you have work to get to as well." Caleb didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached over to the nightstand, grabbing his phone and typing a quick message before setting it back down. "There, cleared my morning," he said simply. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Just like that," he smirked. "Perks of being the boss." She shook her head but couldn't fight the warmth that bloomed in her chest. Later that afternoon, they walked through the streets together, something they had never done before. Their world had always been one of quiet conversations in dimly lit spaces, of stolen moments behind closed doors. But now, out in the open, it felt different. Elena glanced up at him as they walked, noting the way people's eyes followed him. Caleb Donovan wasn't the kind of man who blended into a crowd. He commanded attention effortlessly, and yet, here he was, completely at ease beside her. They passed a small flower stand, and before Elena could react, Caleb reached out, plucked a single bloom from the display and handed it to her as he pulled out his wallet. The vendor waved him off. No charge, a man who buys flowers for his woman like that. "That's worth more than money." Elena's fingers curled around the stem as Caleb's gaze met hers with quiet amusement. She shook her head. "You're ridiculous," he smirked. "And yet you're still here." She rolled her eyes but couldn't stop herself from smiling. That evening they sat on the rooftop of the penthouse, looking out over the city. A bottle of wine sat between them, half empty, the conversation flowing as easily as the night breeze. Elena traced the rim of her glass, her expression thoughtful. "This, whatever this is." "It wasn't supposed to happen." Caleb turned his head slightly, watching her. "And yet here we are." She let out a soft breath, shaking her head. "I've spent so long trying to keep people at a distance, telling myself that if I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't get hurt." Caleb set his glass down, shifting so he was fully facing her. "And now," she met his gaze, searching for the right words, "and now, I don't want to run." Something in his expression changed, a quiet intensity settling over him. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Then don't. Elena squeezed his hand, grounding herself in the certainty of his touch. No more running, no more doubts, just them. Together, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough.